this is Michèle from Jasami Bookworm Podcast, and I am so delighted to invite back Steve Logan for this episode, as we'll be talking about his new poetry release, Heartlands. Welcome, Steve.
Hi, Michelle. It's great to be back.
Oh, well, it's always a pleasure to speak with you because I always learn so much. And poetry is such a personal it to each individual. That's something that
Mm.
means so much. And just to kind of reiterate about hiraeth and what it means, would you please give us kind of the definition about that again, and then we'll go in back into Heartlands.
Okay. Hiraeth is a word that means roughly longing, and I understand it as longing for a place that you think of as especially your home. It might not be your actual home. It's more likely to be a place that has the qualities of a home. It might be a home that you've left behind. It might be a home that you dream of having, but it will often be in a country or in an imaginary environment that has certain special qualities. And in my case, that was the culture of the valleys of South Wales, which I left for the first time when I was about 11, but constantly revisited and still revisit now. And when I'm away from there, I find myself yearning for it in certain ways. And I think that that feeling is widespread, not for the valleys, of course, though there may be some listeners who have an attachment to that particular area, but nearly everybody has got an attachment to some area that's especially meaningful to them, particularly in our age of widespread population dispersal. So I feel that in the West, usually for economic reasons, we've grown up thinking that we should always go where the work is. And a thing that commonly happens in the UK and probably in the US and other parts of the West is that people move away from home when they go to university. And usually once they've gone, they never return to live permanently in the place that they grew up in. So this will mean that there are millions, probably billions of people who have a memory of the place that they grew up in when they're living somewhere else. It may be that they have a negative memory of it. They may be very glad to get away from it, but it may also be that they don't, that they think fondly of that place. And if they find that they go to some other place which lacks the qualities that particularly endear their first place to them, then they may find themselves yearning for that first place, for the idea of it, because by the time that the yearning starts, the place has often changed. It may no longer look the same. The people that you are thinking of may no longer be there, or they may have died. But you will imagine that place as having within it the qualities that you feel you need in order to satisfy yourself and make your life fulfilling. So that's what hiraeth is about. It's for longing. It's the word that means longing for that.
I think what drew it more personally to myself is that although, as everybody knows, I'm from Canada, I'm born there, and it's a country of birth, but all of my family was born in Glasgow. And whenever I was away, I always said, I'm going home for a visit. And that was Scotland. And that was my sense of longing and my sense of belonging. And for me, it was about family. I think that you're absolutely correct, Steve. Scotland's changed over many, many years. I will say that since I've been home for 15 years now, uh, I always felt I never belonged. And now I feel I do. And I think your poetry gives an individual the sense of belonging, you know, something that we can, even if it's just, if it's a place or a person, you might be content within someone's arms, and that is the sense of belonging. So it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be a physical place as well.
No, no. I think one of the reasons that we talk about physical places is to take the abstract out of the discussion, because really what I think this feeling of longing is about is everything that formed you. And a word that would denote that would be culture. But within, let's say, the culture of a city, there will be the culture of a particular bit of a city. Then there'll be the culture of the family that you come from. And these things give you your moral orientation. They, even if you've grown up in a family, let's say, that you rebel against, you get your moral orientation from rebelling against those particular things. So they are crucially important in your formation. And when you go away, that culture that formed you may no longer be present. So in my particular case, I went away to, first of all, to a school that was in Berkshire, and it was very different from where I'd grown up. It was in England rather than in Wales, and many people just think of Wales as being, you know, slightly to the left of England, but actually, you know, it's different in many profound ways. I wasn't conscious of that. I just felt, as you put it, that I didn't quite fit, that there were certain things that weren't familiar to me in the way that they would have been if I'd stayed put. And then, you know, later in life, when I started working in universities, I found myself in Oxford and Cambridge. And although those places have many things to offer, which the valleys didn't have in the same form, they lacked certain other things which were very present in the valleys. So because of moving around to those places and other places beside, I spent a lot of time living in London. And early in my life, because my mother lived in London, I started moving between South Welsh valleys and London very regularly from the age of about 7. Um, I became very conscious of cultural difference. I suppose that many people who stay in the same place all of their lives don't need to be conscious of that in the same way, because they'll always have a sense of coming back into the thing that formed them. But if you don't come back into the thing that formed you, then you may always have this slight sense of not being quite where you belong or where you fit. You may have adapted and you may have come to love the place that you're in, but it won't be quite the same as it was when you were in that first place. And that was the case with me, and in a sense remains the case with me. So when I go back to South Wales, I suddenly feel that all sorts of things which I have to think about a bit carefully when I'm not there, I don't have to think about anymore, because I understand how it works, or I think I understand how it works. Um, and I suppose that that is a pretty widespread feeling, because you could go as far to say as to say that almost everybody now is to some extent and in some sense an exile.
I think, to take it a step further, we almost sometimes feel an exile within ourselves,
Mhm.
because when we don't understand within ourselves, and there is so much of that, particularly in today's society,
Yeah.
where it's a sense of belonging. You know, when I grew up, everybody knew where they were from. You know, you were born here, you belonged there, that's what it was. And that, I think that was a stronger sense than nowadays, because, and I think part of the sense of belonging and knowing where we're from is because of the social media,
Yeah.
everything, you know, within the world. We're a global community, which is wonderful. But the other part of a global community is that it's such an amalgamation of everything.
Yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
sense of identity, the sense of belonging in that where do you belong? It's expressed in different ways, and I'm going to digress from the poetry for a moment to talk about your music. I had to bring that up. Uh,
Okay.
when creating poetry and that creative part of your nature, how different is it to create the music that you write? I'm kind of putting them on the spot, everyone, because I didn't talk about this earlier.
Okay. Well, it's both different and the same, as you'd sort of expect me to say. Because the kind of music that I do is rock music, alternative rock music, and what I make are not symphonies or concertos, but songs, and songs have words. There is one obvious point of connection between making a poem and, let's say, writing a song lyric. And as I'm fond of saying, song lyrics and page poetry, the poetry that you read on a page with no music, they're very closely connected, although they've grown apart. So historically, the kind of poetry that I write now and that is in my book Heartlands is called lyric poetry. And it's called lyric poetry because it was originally written to be accompanied by the lyre. That's to say, the poetry was really words for a song. And probably there were lots of variations of this. There might have been music that just went on in the background to some narrative poem that went on for a considerable length of time. But there were also have been, we know that there were, let's say in ancient Greece, in the 5th century before Christ, in Athens, for example, there were poets who wrote short poems that were clearly intended to be accompanied by music. And those poems, therefore, would have been, by our modern definitions, songs. But then over time, people started writing short poems that didn't necessarily have music. And often we read even the poems that were written to go with music, we often read as though they didn't have any music because we've lost the music. An example of that would be the Psalms in the Bible, which are older still. And many of those begin by giving an indication of the particular instruments that are meant to accompany their recital. So in the ancient world, poetry and music were thought of as very closely akin. And then gradually, as we come into the modern age, let's say as we reach the Renaissance, uh, there is a form of poetry that isn't intended to have any music with it, and we just call that poetry. And then there's a form of poetry that is intended to have music with it. We call that lyrics. So they're closely connected. But when I write a poem that I don't intend to go with any music, I'm using different words. I'm organizing the words differently. What Bob Dylan calls the idioms are different. So you can say certain things in a page poem, let's call them that. You can say certain things in a page poem that you can't so easily say in a song lyric, and vice versa. Song lyrics tend to be, and these are not hard and fast rules, they're just rules of thumb, but song lyrics tend to be more elliptical. That's to say that, they jump across gaps in meaning, and the listener has to fill those gaps for themselves. Page poems tend to be a bit more explicit, and people expect a page poem to explain itself a bit more. So that part of the two things, writing songs and writing poems, the word part is similar but different. But when it comes to the music, of course, there's the similarity there is just a matter of impulse. So when I'm trying to work out a melody, let's say, I may or I may not have some words already. I may just be sitting playing a guitar and trying to make up a chord sequence. And if I get the chord sequence and I like it, I might then start humming a melody over the top of it. So there's something that's pushing me or urging me to make a, a piece of music. And it's the same kind of urge that I get when I'm making a page poem. So at, at their root, at their source, making a song and making a page poem are the same. But as you express that impulse, either in just words that are meant to be read or in words that go with music, as you express it, then they diverge. And that's why in our culture now, every single person that you meet in the street will know at least fragments of dozens of songs, but hardly anybody will know dozens of poems.
And that's the difference from years ago. People used to recite poetry, and that was learned, and it was before.
Yeah,
And technology is lovely, but it does come with certain detriments to it in that we don't have to remember things the way we used to. They used to remember, entire, pages and tens of pages and hundreds of pages
yeah.
of a poem. The one question that came to mind, Steve, when you were talking about the difference between writing, poetry and pages and writing music and writing the words to music, is that the intention. Is
Mm.
there a difference in the intention of what you write between your poetry and your music? And what I mean by that is, I remember you said one of the poems that you wrote, it was about, I think it was your aunt, it was gifts. And you pulled
Yeah,
over in a very short period of time, you wrote that because you were inspired at that moment.
yeah.
And I think poetry does, have a lot of inspiration
Yeah.
behind it. Whereas the music, how much, inspiration to the music is there that differentiates from the poetry? And a second question, which we'll come back to, but have you ever written something that did not, was completely different from what you intended it to be, whether
Oh,
it
yeah.
was poetry or music? So we'll go back to the first one and I'll remember the second one. Uh,
Okay.
the writing.
Okay. Well, intention's a complicated thing. I mean, I think intention starts off just as an urge, and it's very vague. It's like the it's like the impulse to show somebody kindness or support, or the impulse to be angry. You know, that's a very quite an abstract thing. Um, But I'd say that the kind of spark that you were talking about when you mentioned gifts happens with song lyrics as well as with page poems. And sometimes when I start writing, which I do every day, I don't know which one of those two forms the thing that I'm writing is going to end up as. Sometimes I'll be looking for subject matter. I'll be looking quite hard. I'll be reviewing things that have happened during the last day that may have some connection with what I think of as the deep sources of creativity, the things that really move me and compel me. Other times I would have noticed something and I know that there is a song or a poem in it. And it's just a matter of me trying to bring that into full expression. But I've often begun writing what I thought was a page poem that's turned into a song. And equally, I've begun writing a song that's turned into a page poem. And I have some poems that I plan to turn into songs, although they were written as poems. In fact, I was only thinking yesterday a of a poem that I wrote when I was 16, and I thought, yes, that would make a good song. And the reason that it occurred to me was that I was listening to a song by somebody else that had the title of a novel by D.H. Lawrence. So the title was Women in Love. So that was the title of the song and also the title of Lawrence's novel. And then I remembered that I'd written a poem called Sons and Lovers, which is the title of a novel by D.H. Lawrence too. So that's an example of the sort of unexpected thing that can prompt you to making a creative experiment. So I haven't done that yet, but I may very well do it.
Do you think that your writing harkens back to any certain period of time, the creativity, when you mentioned D.H. Lawrence, that feel of that time period? Or do you believe that it's all timeless, that work and creativity is?
Well, I've had the experience many times of performing songs and then hearing what people make of them. And it's often a bit surprising. You can have a very definite scenario in your mind when you're singing the song, and then somebody can react to it and tell you, oh, I'm so glad that you wrote that highly political song about so and so. And, that wasn't what you were thinking of consciously at all. So I know that there can be quite a difference between what I think of as the the nub of any particular song or poem and what somebody else perceives as the nub of it. But yes, do I think that there are certain ranges of subject matter that trigger me or are especially important to me? Well, yes, I do. It's clear that I write quite a lot of poems and still do, write a lot of poems that have a relation to my background in South Wales. But they're not all set in the past because I have current experience of South Wales, and therefore I write about political things, for instance, which are going on now. And I might, when I'm writing, let's say, a song about that, I might either very deliberately put in the locations or the South Welsh references because I want people, or I might make the song more oblique than I need to because I want people to see it in relation to a variety of things, not just what I'm mentioning. But I suppose that even if I wrote let me try to think. I've recently written things which are about the current Israel-Palestinian conflict and the horrors of that. That's a contemporary event, but I suppose that my take on it is to a large extent conditioned by my background. I was noticing recently that I tend to admire artists who are in some sense marginalized, who are disregarded, or who look at the industry that they're trying to be a part of and either rebel against it or choose actually not to go along with it. I was thinking of people like Richie Edwards, the Manic Street Preachers, a band that grew up in a part of Wales very close to the place I grew up. I was thinking of Idris Davis, who is a very popular South Welsh poet, but only in Wales. He's not very well known outside, and he's not highly regarded by the intelligentsia, I think, in South Wales anymore. Then I was thinking of John Berryman, the American confessional poet, and how so much of his life seemed to exist at the margins of his own reputation. So he had quite a big reputation, but his poems were often about very private, very side issues. And even people who, you talk about being exiled within. So I wrote a book about Wordsworth, and Wordsworth in all sorts of ways is a huge, very well-known figure, but he wasn't when he was young, and he had a secret life that not everyone is aware of. I mean, Wordsworth fathered a child when he was a very young man in revolutionary France. And then he left revolutionary France, and he didn't become involved in the upbringing of his daughter. So that was something that Wordsworth did, and which would have had an effect on him and on other people around him who knew about it. That's a kind of hidden pain. And then C.S. Lewis, another writer that I admire, he had a very, very deep attachment to his own mother. But he didn't write about that very much. However, it expressed itself in him forming a relationship with a woman who was very considerably older than himself, who, when she became ill, he looked after devotedly and tended to refer to as his mother. So there was this, again, this kind of private dimension to his life, which had pain within it. And I am very interested in that because I think that everyone has something of that kind, something that privately troubles you quite a lot, but you may not be able to speak about in public, either through shame or even through not recognizing that it's there. So that kind of interest, I think, comes from my own experience, when I was growing up and getting displaced from one culture to another, growing up between my guardians and my parents who were living elsewhere. But also I am aware that Wales is often, as a whole, marginalized, and many great things have come out of Wales, and out of South Wales, for example. The Chartist movement came, which is one of the reasons that working class people have a vote. And that was partly, not exclusively, but it was partly, Welsh miners campaigning and being willing to die, actually, to get the right to vote. There are many things like that. There are decisions that used to be made on behalf of the government in Westminster that affected South Wales, not exclusively, but it affected South Wales very profoundly, like closing the pits, closing the steelworks. These things happen very, very quickly, and the consequences are cultures that had taken a long time to build up suddenly having their central focus removed. So because those are my experiences and those are my interests, the subject matter of my poems and my songs tends to circle around issues like that, issues of social justice, let's say, issues of working class life as against middle class life. Although I don't think the two are have to be always polarized.
I think the expression of everyone who is creative, and you as a musician and a poet, and although it expresses itself from what your personal experiences are and your beliefs, I think the most important part is that it expresses itself to others. So in
Yeah.
a gentle way that they bring their own lives and can, with bringing, as I say, bring your own baggage. We do a lot of editing as a publishing company, obviously. An editor cannot bring a lot of their own history to editing a story. We can't help but bring part of ourselves to any story we do. So that's part of it, is that when we read a poem, the words that are there, when we listen to a song, the words that are there, the melody that's behind it, whatever it is, it will touch every individual in their
Yes.
own personal way.
Yeah.
And I think that's a gift that you, as a poet and a musician, have. And sharing that is so important, because whoever hears it, whoever reads the poem, reads it aloud, shares it with someone else, they listen to the song, listen to the music, listen to the words. And then that brings something, a message within to them, which they can relate to or argue with or say they don't believe it. But whatever it is, it evokes an emotion, which I
Yeah.
think is the most important part of the creativity of being a
I
poet
think
and musician.
that's true. I think it's very important what you say about connections happening between people who are very different and whose experiences have been very different. Um, I think that, for example, when you listen to a singer that you like, not just that you like, but that you like very much indeed, someone that whose singing is important to you, what are you actually getting? So you listen to their voice and you listen perhaps to the words that they're singing. You might not be able to make out all the words, but you can hear some quality in their voice. You know, you might be able to hear strength or vulnerability or anguish, or fury or distress, or you hear these qualities in voices, and they which have been released very often by the words. So it's almost as if the words in the song are the means by which the singer can release something deeper. And great singers, I think, are people who habitually do that. They tap into some hidden private reserves of emotional energy as a result of trying to express what's in the words in front of them. Um, because it's in the news at the moment, Amy Winehouse, would be an example of somebody who is doing that, I think. And she had, as everyone knows, her own way of pronouncing words, which often made them, for some people, difficult to recognize. But they're still getting this other thing that's coming through. And I admire, a range of singers who are very different from each other. A couple of them are Canadian, actually. Neil Young is one. Joni Mitchell's another. Well, actually, is the third one. Leonard Cohen is another. But coming more up to date, a singer that I admire, who wouldn't really describe himself as a singer, is Jay Maskis out of a band called Dinosaur Jr. And if you ask me, well, what am I responding to when I listen to him sing? I don't quite know. But there's something that his voice is symbolizing that seems to me truthful and genuine. And I think that that is what goes on when you listen to music, particularly. But when you read poems too, people often talk about the voice of the poet, which is strange, particularly when they've never heard the voice of the poet. And if you're talking about old poets, you can't hear their voices because they were before recording. So but you get the sense of a voice, whether it's a gentle, a hectoring, a tortured voice, whatever it is, a calm, a steadying voice. All these things you can pick up from the way that words are organized, and that's what you connect with. So although it's true that we all go to the books or the songs that have subject matter that we think, oh yes, I'll be interested in that. If it goes any deeper than that, it will be because of this other thing, that the subject matter is like a door through which you gain access to the, shall we call it, the soul of the person who's making that work. And for that reason, people have very deep attachments, particularly to musicians that they admire, but to writers too. But the attachment, it's not to the actual person, it's to their idea of the person.
Absolutely. And I think for me, it's one of my favorite songs, and it's everybody's going to laugh. It's from the 40s, but the song is the memory of my mom and dad. And it's Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. And I
Yeah,
remember my mom and dad waltzing in the living room. And every time I hear that song, it brings such joy to my heart. I
yeah.
just, within three notes, name that tune, within three notes. But I think that something that we particularly love touches us that way. I also think it's wonderful when something comes up that makes us think in poetry that we may not agree with, but it makes us consider, view alternative ideas. Say,
Yeah,
it might even be jarring and
yeah,
we disagree with it. The best part of that is it makes us think, and thinking about it and considering it and mulling it over and exploring the words, the ideas. And that's what is so important in today's society, Steve. We need more of that. We need
yeah,
more of exploration of language. When we say a word, what does that word mean? When we read a line, don't just read the line and go on to the next one. What does that line mean? What is that conveying? And the way your poetry is written is that not everything has to rhyme to be a poem. What
sure.
happens is that it's the story within the poem that comes to life that I
Yeah.
think you express so well, that I think people really need to explore. And so having said that, I said it's going to be a 4-part series, so this is part 2. And I I love sharing ideas. I love hearing about the creativity and how it's expressed and how you create it and the basis for it, where it originated from, Steve. So of course we're talking about Heartlands, and we want everyone to buy the poetry book. Also, Steve Logan is a musician, very talented. So you can explore that side, and we'll have all of the links in the description. And this comes to the time which I never tell anybody about, and it's the call out, shout out to. So I'll babble for about 10 seconds for you to come out, come through with the idea of who your shout out is to, Steve. Uh,
Okay. I'm trying to remember who my shout out was to the first time round. Was it
you can
to
repeat it. It's fine. Don't worry.
okay, I think that my first shout out was to Pamela Petro, who has written a magnificent book called The Long Field, which is about hiraeth. And she's not Welsh, but she understands this subject very profoundly, very well, and writes beautifully. But the other person that I'd give a shout out to is my friend, the poet Patrick, who's a poet from South Wales. He's the brother of Nicky Wire, who's the bass player in the Manic Street Preachers. Um, Patrick is somebody that came strongly to mind when you were talking about the way that poems can stimulate new thinking. And I thought of the range of his poems. So some of his poems are incantations. They are poems which, by the way that they manipulate words, draw you into a spell of feeling. And many of those poems are sad and poignant. Um, and then on the other hand, he writes political poems which are intended to provoke and which very explicitly attack things that he disapproves of. So he's a poet with great range, and he recently published a selected poems called Fuse oblique Fracture, and that will give you the full range of his work.
It's always wonderful to hear different shout outs from everyone. So my shout out is to poets, young poets, and I might have done this the last time, but I don't mind repeating it. It's about creating something within yourself, expressing your emotions, thoughts, ideas that you want to share. Don't ever give up on that, and don't ever stop it. Write, even if it's not ever shared with anyone, write, continue to express, because I think expressing it gives such a relief and release to yourself. So that's my shout out. I wish to thank you very much, Steve, for joining us again.
And thank you very much indeed for giving me such a valuable opportunity to talk.
It's always a pleasure, Steve. I always learn something, and it's such a lovely intellectual discussion. So once again, this is Michèle from Dasami Bookworm Podcast. And as always, I wish you a sunny day.